Well, good morning, brothers and sisters. Yes, so I have titled this exhort Tears in Heaven, and it comes on the back of a couple of wonderful exhortations that we've had recently in the past from Brother Paul Osborne in Canada, who dealt with expressing emotion through the Psalms, and also through a Family Matters by Sister Kathy Strachan dealing with loss and grief. And I found those very helpful. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to those, I encourage you to go onto the Pakuranga website and find those talks, the Family Matters one and the exhortation by Paul Osborne, because they were very helpful. This title, of course, Tears in Heaven, for those who are very worldly and like worldly music, will know that it actually comes from a song written by Eric Clapton. It's perhaps deemed to be the saddest song ever written, because it commemorates the very tragic loss of his 4-year-old son, Connor, who fell from a 53rd story building in a New York apartment. And for a long time, Eric Clapton became a bit of a recluse, but he composed and wrote this song in trying to deal with the grief of the loss of his son. And it caused me to think back to my childhood, back when I was 4 years old. And I had a great childhood when I was 4 years old, because my father was bit of a hobbyist, liked to build things, liked to do things with his hands, very much liked to invent things. So our backyard was pretty cool. So here's a picture of our backyard. Oh, maybe not. No, it was not quite like that. It was probably more like this. So you see, Dad made all of these cool things for us. He made swings and forts, and that thing that you see there on the screen of the guy on the barrel on the spring, yeah, Dad made one of those, which was perhaps one of the first ones ever made. It was instead of a bucking bronco, it was a pig on a spring. And I loved all the things, and so did all the kids around the neighborhood. They used to come to our backyard because we had such cool stuff that they could play on. I loved the swings, I loved the forts. I loved the pig on the spring, but you know, there was one part of our backyard equipment that I did not like at all. In fact, it engendered a lot of fear to me, because it was quite terrifying, and that was the seesaw. I know that's what you're thinking too, seesaws. Terrifying things. And it wasn't because Dad's seesaw was a little bit funky, in that it was probably more like this seesaw, in that it could spin round and round, but we didn't have bulls chasing us. It was the fact that I was the youngest sibling, and you see, when I was 4, my older brother, he was 8, or at one stage 9, so he was 4.5 years older than me. And so when Mum and Dad were out in the playground and we're playing together, as the little 4-year-old on the seesaw with his brother, it kind of went like this. It was just a joyous time. But then, of course, when Mum and Dad went back inside and it was just the big brother and little brother, it kind of ended up more like this. Because the seesaw was kind of this thing where, you know, when you're the youngest and the lightest, it can be a very dangerous thing. And as a child, you could voice your anger, your fear, your frustration by something which is natural within us, by crying, by expressing that pain and that anguish and running to Mum and Dad and telling on your big brother. And the tears would flow. And you know, it's in us as humans. God has put this there, and it's natural for us to have these emotions. And in fact, it's said we're the only part of God's, or species of God's creation that cry as such. You know, you might think elephants certainly get close. They show or seem to be very sad. Crocodiles don't, by the way, they don't really cry at all. But we're really the only species that has built into us this thing where we can show our emotion through tears. But that's what you do when you're young. But when you get older, well, it's not cool to cry, especially not for us stiff upper lip colonials that don't want to show their emotion, because that's showing weakness. So years later in my life, where we went through the trauma of financial collapse, my big brother, the same one that at 9 threw me off the seesaw, years later, when we went through financial collapse, he was the first one to come and offer support and help. In fact, in more recent times, my brother has been somewhat the rock of the family whenever there's been family crises and issues to deal with. But I refused help because, well, I had it covered. And what gets in the way when we get older of receiving help is this big burden of pride, this thing that says, look, I've got it. You see, when you think about the playground situation, the swings, the forts, even that really dangerous pig on a spring, I mean, there was no health and safety protocols at our house. In fact, I think what Dad did was he said, well, if Mum could ride it, it was safe for the kids. And the fact that my mother is an adrenaline junkie was that, you know, she was up there riding it saying, yep, just let it go. We won't even talk about the trampoline that Dad made. But the thing is, in all of those things, the swing, the slides, the forts, even the trampoline, if I fell off and hurt myself, it was me. I was in control. I could look and say, well, you know, I did something wrong, but it was events that I was in control of that caused the pain or caused the anguish. But you see, the seesaw was a situation where I was not in control. I was totally, absolutely dependent upon the harmony and balance that could be provided by my older sibling. And so the fear of these things that come through into adulthood can be seen where, you know, as a grandparent, here's an example of somebody that perhaps has had that experience in the past of the fear of the seesaw. And now his grandkids are there saying, come on, Granddad, play with me on the seesaw. And he's terrified because of the trauma that's happened in the past. And it doesn't take long before the pain and anguish occurs all over again. So how do we learn to deal with the things we can't control? Because right now we're living in a pretty strange world. Around us, there are a whole lot of things happening where we are not in control. And there is a lot of pent-up anger and a lot of pent-up frustration about trying to deal with circumstances that are out of our control. And with the story of the seesaw, there is a lesson to be learned. When you have experiences in the past that bring trauma, you often have this burden which comes through things like trauma, where we get post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, trying to deal with an event that happened in your past. You get regret for things that perhaps you could have done and shouldn't have done. And then you get guilt for things you did do that you shouldn't have done. And all of those negative things that happen in your past, like Newton's law and like the seesaw, they have an equal and opposite reaction. And so trauma presents to you this perspective of looking to the future with fear. I don't know how to deal with the future because of this traumatic experience in my past. What if it happens again? And what if it's out of my control? I didn't handle it well last time. Regret is where we sit back and say, well, I don't know whether I can look to the future. I don't believe in myself because I failed last time and I didn't do this, and all of a sudden engenders self-doubt. And then, of course, guilt, that creates within us this complete uncertainty of our ability to be able to move forward. And so what we end up doing on the seesaw is a bit like Snoopy here. We put our feet up and we sit down and we don't want to move. And no matter how God might be working in our life to try to get us moving forward, we get stuck in the seesaw, stuck in a rut, stuck in our past. So what I wanted to do by way of exhortation is take two examples to look at this morning of how these two brothers learned how to deal with the things they cannot control in their life. And the first one's a bad example, and the second one is a good example. The first one's the story of Jacob and Esau. And we know the story pretty well. You know, Jacob, a little bit like me, I was the younger sibling, maybe not 4 years apart, maybe only 4 minutes apart. But the difference was, you know, like these two brothers, one of them was very strong. Jacob was a very strong boy. There's no doubt about that, because you read of some of his exploits later on in life, and rolling away big stones and being a big hardy shepherd. But as strong as he was and as powerful as he was nothing compared to his brother that literally came out of the womb like a big orangutan. And this red-haired monster of a brother was a powerful hunter. Now, I imagine when these two boys grew up, when they were young, Esau would always want to play the hunter with his brother, like hide and seek. I'm the hunter, you're the animal. I'm the lion, you're the gazelle. And Jacob would spend his younger days trying to outfox, be more cunning, to try to get away from his brother. And every time his brother caught him, I would imagine there would be a little bit of rough and tumble, like the lion suddenly getting his prey. And Jacob probably had traumatic experiences as a young kid in fear of his brother and the bruises that might have followed. And that carried on all through his life, until, of course, when he was older, he had to flee from his brother because he had continued his cunning and his trickery to the point where his brother wanted to murder him. And he spent 20 years hiding from the face of his brother. And then the day came when he was going to face his brother 20 years later. And he had woken up in cold sweats and nightmares thinking about this hunter that was hunting him for 20 years and at any time could suddenly pounce out of nowhere. And I want you to read just quickly Genesis chapter 32 with me. Because when Jacob comes to meet his brother, this is his most terrifying moment. He is not in control of the events taking place in his life at this time. And he is scared, and he openly admits it. And what he does is he comes to a place, and it says in Genesis chapter 32, he went on his way and the angels of God met him. Isn't that a remarkable thing, you know? God's angels come to Jacob to give Jacob reassurance, to say to Jacob, it's okay, Jacob, I've got this. You can trust in me. And that's what the angels appear to Jacob, because Jacob had prayed, and the last time he had seen the angels was at Bethel, and he had prayed and said, if you are with me and bring me back into the land. Now he's coming back, and the angels appear again and saying, I'm with you. And so he makes this intense prayer to God. And it's a powerful prayer. So have a look at verse 9. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, the God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return to your country, to your kindred, that I may do you good. I'm not worthy the least of your deeds, your steadfast love, and all your faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I've become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother and the hand of Esau, for I fear him that he might come and attack me and the mother with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring like the sand of the sea that cannot be numbered. Now that's awesome prayer to God. But then you know what he does in the next verse? So he stayed there that night, and he took what he had, a present for his brother, 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 100 ewes, 20 lambs. Jacob is now sitting there thinking, well, that was a lovely prayer. I've laid it all at God's feet. Now what can I do? He unloads his whole burden to God, and then he's still sweating, and he's still thinking, and he's thinking about his brother approaching it. So he picks that burden up again, and he says, I know you said that you've got this, God, but I don't like the way you're driving. I don't like the paths you're taking me. I don't want to lose control. And so he takes control back from God, and he starts putting together this huge bribery package to his brother. And he tries to organize all of these things to appease his brother Esau. And so the angel of God meets him that night. And I'm sure that Jacob thought when the angel of God appeared that it was like Esau attacking him in the middle of the night. And he has this wrestle with God. And he wrestles with God. And this is Jacob wrestling for control with all his might. And of course, he walked away from that night a cripple. And a moment God touched the largest muscle in his body, his thigh, and it shrank. Because God was teaching Jacob that his strength is made perfect in human weakness. The second example, and this is our example we want to think about for exhortation, is the Lord Jesus Christ. No amount of preparation can truly prepare us for trauma or loss. Jesus knew what he was going to face when he went to the cross. He was prepared for it, his Father had told him. Yet when the events came, it was overwhelming. It was incredible. And Jesus wrestling in the garden was not wrestling God, it was wrestling his own nature. He wrestled his own will. And it says in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up with prayers and supplications, loud cries and tears. He let it go. He poured it out like the little child does. And he screamed. And you know, he got up from the garden after crying and praying, and he went to walk out, and he says, I still can't do it. I still can't do it. And he went back to the garden, and he poured his heart out again and again, and he cried and he wept. And then he got up again, and he went back, and he says, I still can't do it. And he went back a third time. And then the third time, the angel came from God and strengthened him. You see, here's the lesson of dealing with things when it's out of control. Is it might not take one prayer. It might take an intensity of keeping on going back. But if we don't, then the psalmist said, when I kept silent, my bones waxed away through my groaning all day long. Day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up by the heat of summer. And in silence, it was like the psalmist said, he was eaten away. And you know, when you talk about bottling up emotion, eventually something's going to happen. And I just wanted to take this one psalm here. We had a number of psalms by Paul Osborne the other day, but I wanted to read this out of the Message Bible to show how that intense, continuous crying and tears. Psalm 88, I'm standing my ground, God, shouting for help. At my prayers every morning, on my knees each daybreak. Why, God? Why do you turn a deaf ear? Why do you make yourself scared? For as long as I can remember, I've been hurting. I've taken the worst you can hand out. I've had it. Your wildfire anger has blazed through my life. I'm bleeding. I'm black and blue. You've attacked me fiercely on every side, raining down blows until I'm nearly dead. And here is the psalmist expressing, crying and weeping before God. And so, in trying to deal with the things we can't change, the things which happen to us, and trying to be able to find a path to the future, there's this statement. No amount of regret can change the past. No amount of anxiety can change the future, but any amount of gratitude changes the present. And this is the story of finding balance on the seesaw between the past and the present, which you can't change, but we spend 90% of our time worrying about. And trying to find how to deal with the things we can't change is to find strength in the middle of the seesaw. Because in the middle of the seesaw is that place where we find balance. And Paul says it this way, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching out for those things which are ahead. And he says, for I am able to do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Because at the center of the seesaw is the fulcrum. That's where the strength is. And because I love acronyms, here's one for you for fulcrum. Faith in understanding the love of Christ restores unity and balance and creates motion, creates energy to move forward. And we've just been reading Colossians. There's a beautiful quote in the next chapter in Colossians which expresses this. Above all these things, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony, and let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, which indeed were called in one body, and be thankful, be grateful. Find thankfulness in the present. How do we find the love of Christ? To find that strength. Here's something amazing. I just couldn't believe this when I saw this. And Darren Horror will really appreciate this, I'm sure. And he'd be able to explain perhaps a little bit more about the Hebrew here. But the Hebrew word for tears, which is all through the Old Testament, the word dema means tears. I know, that is really amazing. It means to weep or to cry. And perhaps Darren would give some explanation to the actual Hebrew letters here, which perhaps look like tears falling off the bottom of the letters and pouring out. But this word is always used of tears, of weeping and crying. But there's another word which is almost exactly the same, completely related. This word 1832 in the Strong's Dema is exactly the same idea as this word 1831, which is a word that says dema, but it's only used once in the whole of the Bible. And it's the same word for tears, but just slightly different. And it's the liquid that comes from fruit, in particular, the grape. And it's used in this verse. And it's the only time it appears. You shall not delay to offer the fullness of your harvest and the overflow of your presses, the squeezing of your presses. And then look at this next part. And the firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You know why? You have not resisted yet unto blood, striving against sin. When Jesus was in the garden and he poured out tears and strong crying and tears, his sweat came out of his skin like great drops of blood. And it was like the squeezing of the grape. He squeezed everything out of it. And that was God's only begotten Son. And that's why we need to be grateful in the present. That's why we need to look around and be able to handle whatever our past is or whatever the future is. It's for what God has given us right now. And in a world which is angry and frustrated and mad, and there's anger going everywhere, there's peace in knowing that our life is hid with Christ. And you know what else? I think this is amazing for our story in Tears in Heaven. For all the pain, for all the anguish, when we let it go and when it pours forth and we weep and cry before God, not one tear is wasted, not one tear is lost. In our psalm that we read, it says, you keep track of all my sorrows. You've collected the tears in your bottle and put them in remembrance. And God is collecting those tears. So rather than us bottling them up, he bottles them up. He preserves them. Because at one day, we're going to understand exactly all our sufferings, all our trial, all our pain. And of course, he's going to wipe every tear from our eyes. There won't be any more death, any more mourning, any more crying, any more pain. And the old order of things will be passed away. Just as no amount of preparation can fully prepare us for the trial and traumas that may lay ahead in life, nothing can prepare us for the joy that is also set before us. Psalm 126, I'm going to read that for you to finish. The Lord restored the fortunes of Zion. We were like those who dreamed. Then our mouths was filled with laughter, and our tongue with shouts of joy. Then they said amongst the nation, the Lord has done great things. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are glad. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like the streams of Negeb. Those that sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He that goes out weeping, bearing a seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him. Even so, come, Lord Jesus.